In January of 1787, a woman in London sat down at her writing desk and composed a letter to her uncle back in Massachusetts. The United States had been independent for less than 4 years. Money was a mess. The economy was a mess. A farmers' revolt called the Shays Rebellion was tearing through Western Massachusetts, scaring everyone and crashing the price of government bonds. Her uncle, who managed her investments while she was abroad, had written to suggest she should sell. She wrote back, and the letter survives, quote, and these are her actual words. Do not be afraid. If one sinks, all must sink, which God forbid. Then she instructed him to buy 200 guineas more. That woman's name was Abigail Adams. She was 42 years old. She was the wife of the future second president of the United States. She was the mother of the future sixth president of the United States. She was raising 4 children while 2 had already passed away. She was running the family farm in Massachusetts while her husband was negotiating treaties in Europe. She had no formal education. Under Massachusetts law, every penny she invested technically belonged to her husband. And on January 24th, 1787, while the rest of America was panicking, Abigail was buying. Welcome to Invest AI Savvy. Welcome to Sunday, May 10th, 2026. And to every mother watching this morning, including my own, happy Mother's Day. We're going to spend the next 12 minutes with one of your greatest, the first one in many ways, because the story I just started telling you is one of the most important stories in the history of American investing, and almost no one knows about it. To understand what Abigail Adams did, you have to understand what 18th century America had just done to itself. The Revolutionary War didn't just kill people, it bankrupted the country. The Continental Congress had no power to tax. So when they needed to pay soldiers, they printed money. When the colonies needed to pay farmers and importers, they printed paper. And by the end of the war, every soldier and every merchant was holding stacks of government certificates that the government had no obvious way to make good on. Paper certificates. Soldiers and farmers needed money, real money, gold and silver. So they sold their certificates, and they sold them for whatever they could get. A piece of paper that said the government owed you 100 pounds was changing hands for about 15 pounds, and sometimes less, sometimes a lot less. The people buying those certificates were called speculators, and most of polite society considered them vultures. John Adams considered them vultures. In 1783, John was finishing up the Treaty of Paris, which was formally ending the Revolutionary War. He wrote home to Abigail with very specific instructions about money. Buy farmland, he said. Buy more farmland. Land is wealth. Land is honest and productive. Land doesn't depend on the trustworthiness of a brand new government that can't pay its bills. Abigail read those letters carefully. She agreed in principle, and then she did something else. She started buying more certificates. She started small. According to the historian Woody Holton, whose biography of Abigail Adams won the Bancroft Prize, she carved out about 100 pounds of the family's available money she described in her own letters as, quote, which I call mine, unquote. And she started speculating in depreciated government securities. And here's one specific trade we have a paper records for. Mrs. Adams bought a certificate with a face value of 100 pounds. She paid about 25 pounds for it. And over the next 4 years, she collected 27 pounds in interest. So before the certificate was even paid off, she'd earned back more than her entire purchase price. The certificate itself was still in her hand. That was a return on capital that John Adams' farmland could not touch in any year, anywhere, ever. And years later, after Alexander Hamilton became Treasury Secretary, he proposed something radical. He proposed that the federal government honor every one of those depreciated certificates at full face value. The plan passed, and Abigail's 25-pound investment became a 100-pound payout, a 4-to-1 return, plus all the interest she'd collected along the way. And she did this dozens of times. Now, here's the part of the story that almost nobody tells. Abigail wasn't doing this between rounds of golf. She was doing this while raising children. She had 6 children. Two of them, a daughter named Susanna and a son named Charles, passed away at young ages. But 4 of the kids survived to adulthood, including John Quincy Adams, who would grow up to become the 6th president of the United States. Abigail was running the family farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, hiring workers, supervising harvests, trading livestock, managing tenants. And at one point, she was also raising her niece. For a stretch, she was raising one of Thomas Jefferson's daughters because Jefferson was also abroad and the families were quite close. And this is what Mrs. Adams was doing while she was building one of the earliest documented investment portfolios in American history. She was also technically breaking the rules. Massachusetts law in the 1780s was very clear. A married woman could not own property. Everything belonged to her husband. So when Abigail wrote that she was investing money, she said, "which I call mine." That phrase was a small act of defiance. She was claiming ownership of money the law said wasn't hers. She covered her tracks. She used what she called the straw men, proxies, to buy the land in her name without her name appearing on the documents. In one transaction, she bought 1,650 acres in Vermont using 4 different proxies to secure a parcel for each of her 4 surviving children. She kept her dealings quiet. She didn't always tell John Adams what she was doing. When her uncle, Cotton Tufts, who handled investments for her while she was overseas, she sometimes routed letters to her daughter so that John Adams, who had no problem opening Abigail's mail, would not see what she was doing. When she did discuss the strategy with John, the disagreements were quite sharp. John Adams believed speculation diverted capital from productive uses. Abigail believed speculation paid better, and eventually she was able to show John a number that ended the argument. His farmland was returning roughly 1% per year. Her bond speculation was returning, in some years, 25%. John Adams couldn't fully come around. He kept buying farms, but he started letting Abigail shift some of the family money into bonds. Now, that is the story of one of the earliest and most successful investors in American history. A woman whose name is on our currency now, but whose actual financial work is barely mentioned in the history or finance textbooks. A working mother of 6, 4 surviving, 3 of whom would carry on the family name across 2 presidencies. Abigail Adams was a speculator, a contrarian, someone who, in January of 1787, sat down in London and wrote, "Do not be afraid." And the reason I'm telling you this on Mother's Day 2026 is that what Abigail Adams figured out in the 1780s is exactly what every BuzzPulse viewer is trying to figure out in 2026. She bought what other people were too scared to buy. Abigail trusted numbers over narrative. Mrs. Adams did her work quietly without telling the crowd while the crowd was panicking. She held positions through volatility because she'd reasoned her way to a thesis instead of feeling her way there. Every one of those is a principle the BuzzPulse system tries to formalize with math. The whole point of a z-score, the whole point of a convergence depth, the whole point of looking at small caps and OTC names instead of the obvious mega cap stuff. It's all the same instinct Abigail Adams had 240 years ago. Go where the math is favorable, go where the crowd isn't, trust the work, hold the position, and don't be afraid. The methodology is new. The discipline is older than the country. Now, here's the last thing I want to say about Abigail Adams. When she died in 1818, after 54 years of marriage, she wrote a will that left the majority of her possessions to her female relatives, her daughters, her granddaughters, her nieces, the women in her family. She had spent her whole life operating around laws that said the money wasn't hers. And in her last act, she made sure that the money she had earned quietly, carefully, against considerable odds, went to the women she had spent her whole life trying to take care of and protect. 240 years later, the idea still works. The lessons are still valid. I'm Ken Carpenter. This is Invest AI Savvy, and that's the way it is.